When my boyfriend proposed, I thought it was the happiest moment of my life. The candlelit restaurant, the soft music playing in the background, the way he dropped to one knee with trembling hands, all of it felt like something out of a dream. I had waited for this moment for years, and now it was finally happening. The ring sparkled under the soft lights, a beautiful vintage piece with an intricate band and a large sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. It was perfect, or so I thought. Ryan slipped the ring onto my finger with a nervous but excited smile, his voice shaking as he asked me to marry him. Of course, I said yes without hesitation, tears welling up in my eyes. The entire restaurant applauded as I threw my arms around him. For weeks afterward, I admired the ring constantly. Friends and family gushed over how beautiful and unique it was. Ryan told everyone he had found it at a small antique shop while traveling for work, claiming he knew instantly it was meant for me. The story was sweet, and I believed every word. But something about the ring nagged at me. Late at night, when the house was quiet and Ryan was asleep beside me, I would stare at the band's intricate design, feeling as though there was more to it than met the eye. The delicate engraving that wrapped around the band was partially worn, but certain patterns seemed too deliberate, too purposeful to be random decoration. It was during one of those late-night musings that I noticed something strange. Running my fingertip along the inner side of the band, I felt a slight indentation, like small grooves etched into the metal. I grabbed a magnifying glass from my desk and examined it closely. My breath caught in my throat when I realized there were tiny letters engraved on the inside. At first, they were too small and worn to read, but with enough light and the right angle, the words slowly became clear. "You will never replace me." My stomach dropped. The words were haunting, filled with bitterness and spite. The sweetness of the proposal instantly soured in my mind. Who would engrave something like that on an engagement ring? My hands shook as I stared at the message, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. I knew Ryan couldn't have missed it. He had picked out the ring himself, or at least that was what he claimed. I couldn't sleep that night. My mind raced with questions and worst-case scenarios. Had he bought the ring secondhand? Was it cursed with some tragic history? Or worse, was there someone from his past who had left this message intentionally? The next morning, I confronted Ryan carefully, trying to mask my panic with curiosity. I asked him again where he had found the ring, pretending I had simply become curious about its origin. He repeated the same story, word for word, about the antique shop he stumbled upon during a work trip. But something in his eyes flickered, a brief flash of discomfort that made my stomach twist even tighter. I pressed a little further, casually mentioning that I had noticed an engraving inside and wondering if he knew about it. His face paled slightly, but he forced a laugh. "Oh, that," he said, waving it off. "The guy at the shop mentioned something about an engraving, but I never really looked at it closely. I thought it added character. Character. That was the word he chose. The word gnawed at me all day. I couldn't let it go." Later that evening, after Ryan fell asleep, I took the ring off and photographed the inscription. I began researching antique jewelry engravings, trying to find any record or history that could explain the strange message. My search led me nowhere. There was no record of the ring, no shop reviews matching Ryan's story, and no way to trace its original owner. Frustrated and desperate for answers, I reached out to a friend of mine who worked as a private investigator. I trusted Sarah implicitly, knowing she could dig deeper than I ever could on my own. I showed her the photos and explained everything. She agreed to look into it discreetly. A few days later, Sarah called me with news that made my blood run cold. The ring had not come from an antique shop. It had belonged to Ryan's ex-fiancée, a woman named Vanessa, who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances 3 years earlier. The case had been briefly investigated but ultimately closed due to lack of evidence. No foul play was confirmed, but Vanessa's sudden disappearance had left her friends and family devastated. The ring had been part of her personal belongings, never officially recovered or accounted for after she vanished. Sarah's discovery shattered the fragile trust I had clung to. Ryan had lied. Not just about the ring, but potentially about something far darker. My mind raced with horrifying possibilities. Had he been involved in Vanessa's disappearance? Was I being pulled into a nightmare I didn't even realize I was living? I confronted Sarah again, asking her to find everything she could about Vanessa and her relationship with Ryan. The more she uncovered, the more disturbing the picture became. Vanessa and Ryan's relationship had been tumultuous. Friends described him as charming but controlling, growing increasingly possessive as their engagement progressed. Vanessa had reportedly expressed fear to close friends before she vanished, even mentioning that she wanted to break off the engagement but was scared of how Ryan might react. The final piece of information Sarah found chilled me to my core. Police reports indicated that Ryan had been the last person to see Vanessa before she disappeared. He claimed she left after an argument and never returned. Despite thorough questioning, there was never enough evidence to charge him with anything. With my heart pounding in my chest, I stared at the ring on my finger, the message inside now screaming at me. "You will never replace me." It wasn't a threat to some future stranger. It was a direct message from Vanessa, etched into the ring before she vanished. She knew something. She left a warning, a desperate attempt to speak even after she was gone. And now that same ring was on my hand, placed there by the man who might have been responsible for her disappearance. I was engaged to someone I no longer truly knew, standing on the edge of a truth too horrifying to fully comprehend. The weight of what I had discovered settled heavily on my chest as I tried to go through the motions of normal life while my mind screamed for answers. Every glance Ryan gave me felt loaded. Every touch made my skin crawl. I began to see his smiles differently, as masks carefully constructed to hide something far more sinister beneath. But I couldn't let him know what I had found, not yet. I needed more proof. Something undeniable. Sarah agreed to keep digging while I played my role, pretending to still be the blissfully engaged fiancé. It was the most exhausting and terrifying act I had ever performed. I smiled at Ryan, accepted his embraces, and pretended to be excited about wedding plans, all while my heart raced with fear and suspicion. My nights were spent in constant anxiety, barely sleeping as I replayed every moment of our relationship, wondering which signs I had missed. Sarah's next call came late at night. She had managed to contact Vanessa's sister, Jenna, who had never stopped believing that Ryan had something to do with her disappearance. Jenna was eager to speak with me, desperate to finally uncover the truth that had haunted her family for years. We arranged to meet at a quiet cafe on the other side of town, far from where Ryan might see us. The moment I saw Jenna, I recognized the same pain and determination that burned inside me. She pulled out a small folder of documents she had kept for years, copies of police reports, text messages Vanessa had sent her, and a few old photos of Vanessa and Ryan together. As I read through the messages, my stomach turned. Vanessa had confided in Jenna about Ryan's possessiveness, how he had become controlling, jealous, and unpredictable. She had tried to leave him once before, but he had convinced her to stay with apologies and promises to change. Vanessa's last message to Jenna was chilling. "If anything happens to me, look at him. Don't believe what he says." I felt the blood drain from my face as I read those words. It was a cry for help from beyond the grave, a desperate plea that no one had been able to act on in time. Jenna told me how Vanessa had bought the ring herself. It wasn't Ryan's choice or gift. She had chosen it because of the engraving option the jeweler offered, intending to write a private message for herself and Ryan. But after one of their worst fights, she had secretly changed the inscription. "You will never replace me." She wanted to remind him that if he ever tried to move on, her memory would haunt him. It was her final act of defiance, a silent rebellion against his control. But then she vanished. And somehow that ring ended up in my hands years later, wrapped in a new lie Ryan had crafted. My hands shook as I closed the folder. The evidence was mounting, but there was still no physical proof tying Ryan directly to Vanessa's disappearance. I thanked Jenna for her help and promised her that I would not let this go. That night, as I lay next to Ryan pretending to sleep, I realized how dangerously close I was to the same fate as Vanessa. I needed to act, but carefully. Sarah and I decided to involve law enforcement directly, but in secret. She introduced me to Detective Marshall, a seasoned investigator, who agreed to reopen Vanessa's case based on the new information. He warned me that building a solid case would take time, and that I had to continue playing along to avoid tipping Ryan off. The plan was to gather enough evidence to secure a warrant for a full search of Ryan's property. In the meantime, Detective Marshall instructed me to begin documenting everything. Any odd behavior, any suspicious comments, anything that might support the growing case against him. Every interaction became a careful game of observation. I installed a hidden recording app on my phone, kept a journal of his movements, and avoided being alone with him whenever possible. Each day was a balancing act between staying safe and gathering the evidence we needed. Then one evening, Ryan suggested a weekend getaway. A cabin in the woods, just the two of us, to celebrate our engagement. The suggestion sent a jolt of panic through me. The isolation, the timing, it all felt like a trap. I made excuses, saying I had work commitments and couldn't get away. Ryan's reaction was unsettling. His charming mask slipped for just a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly before he forced a smile. "That's all right, sweetheart. Plenty of time for trips after we're married." His tone was calm, but something cold lingered behind his words. I reported the conversation to Detective Marshall immediately. The escalation was alarming, and they expedited their investigation. With the information gathered from Jenna, the engraver who confirmed the ring's origin, and my documented evidence, they finally secured a search warrant. The search took place while Ryan was at work, minimizing the risk of confrontation. Officers combed through his home, his car, and even his office. What they found would shatter any remaining illusions. In a locked storage compartment in his garage, they discovered a collection of items belonging to Vanessa: photographs, personal belongings, and most disturbingly, her diary. The entries detailed her growing fear of Ryan, his controlling behavior, and her plans to leave him for good. The final entry was dated just days before her disappearance. Alongside these items, they found digital evidence on his computer. Files of messages Ryan had intercepted, private documents he had stolen from Vanessa, and disturbing search histories about how to make someone disappear without leaving a trace. The evidence was overwhelming. Ryan was arrested at his office the same day. His calm, charming demeanor cracked as officers led him away in handcuffs. The community was stunned, friends and coworkers who had admired him struggling to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster who had lived among them. I watched from a distance, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear, relief, and grief. Vanessa's voice had finally been heard. Her warning, etched into the ring, had led to the truth. Ryan's arrest brought an avalanche of media attention. My engagement was over, and my private nightmare was now a public scandal. But through it all, I felt a growing sense of strength. I had escaped his web, and I had helped bring justice, not just for myself, but for Vanessa, whose story had been silenced for far too long. The weeks following Ryan's arrest were surreal. I found myself suddenly thrown into a whirlwind of police interviews, court preparations, and constant media inquiries. Detectives worked tirelessly to build an airtight case against him, piecing together every thread of evidence that Sarah, Jenna, and I had uncovered. The more they uncovered, the more sinister Ryan's true nature revealed itself to be. Investigators discovered surveillance footage from a gas station where Ryan was seen following Vanessa's car on the night she disappeared. GPS records placed him near a remote hiking trail where her abandoned car was later found. Soil samples from his vehicle's tires matched the location, creating a damning timeline that prosecutors would later present in court. The most chilling discovery came from a hidden folder on his encrypted hard drive. Within it were detailed notes about Vanessa's routines, passwords, and even her family's contact information. He had meticulously documented every aspect of her life, like she was nothing more than a project he was managing. Mixed within those files were documents about me, my social media profiles, private messages, emails, medical records, and even photographs I never knew he had taken. Some were candid shots of me leaving work, shopping, or sitting alone in coffee shops. Ryan had been watching me far more closely than I had ever realized. The discovery made my skin crawl. He had been tracking me long before the proposal, studying me the same way he had once studied Vanessa. I was never just his girlfriend. I was his next target. Prosecutors moved swiftly to charge him with multiple felonies, including kidnapping, unlawful surveillance, stalking, obstruction of justice, and first-degree murder. The mounting evidence finally gave Vanessa's family the closure they had waited years for. But for me, closure was much harder to find. I struggled to sleep at night, haunted by how close I had come to falling into the same trap that had claimed Vanessa's life. Therapy became my anchor. My counselor, Dr. Larson, helped me navigate the complex emotions swirling inside me. The guilt for not seeing the signs sooner. The terror of what could have happened if I hadn't found the engraving. The grief for Vanessa and the horror of realizing how easily Ryan had manipulated my trust. Dr. Larson reminded me that predators like Ryan are masters of deception, using charm and calculated control to disarm their victims. The blame belonged to him, not to me. I repeated those words often, trying to silence the cruel voice inside my head that whispered otherwise. Through the stress, Sarah remained my constant support. She accompanied me to court hearings, handled the endless stream of media requests, and shielded me from reporters who camped outside my apartment for weeks. Jenna and I also grew closer, bound by shared grief and determination. Together, we ensured that Vanessa's voice was never lost again. The trial date approached faster than I expected. Prosecutors briefed me on what to expect, preparing me for my testimony as both a victim and key witness. I would be asked to recount everything, from the day of the proposal to the discovery of the engraving and the terrifying investigation that followed. The day I took the stand was one of the most difficult days of my life. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Cameras captured every moment, broadcasting the trial to an audience far larger than I wanted. I could feel Ryan's eyes on me as I walked past him. He sat at the defense table, his face expressionless but his eyes cold. When I sat down, I steadied my breathing, clutching my hands tightly in my lap to stop them from shaking. The prosecutor's questions guided me through my testimony. I described how Ryan had proposed, the discovery of the engraving, and the unraveling of his carefully constructed lies. My voice trembled at times, but I forced myself to speak with clarity, knowing how important my words were. The defense tried to discredit me, suggesting that I was paranoid, that I had misunderstood Ryan's intentions, that I was exaggerating to gain attention. But the evidence was undeniable. Each attempt to discredit me only strengthened the prosecution's case. The evidence spoke louder than any accusation the defense could throw my way. Photographs, surveillance footage, GPS data, digital files, and testimony from both Sarah and Jenna painted a crystal-clear picture of Ryan's obsession, manipulation, and ultimate guilt. Vanessa's parents sat in the front row throughout the trial. Their quiet strength inspired me. They had waited so long for justice, and now, finally, it was within reach. As the trial drew to a close, the prosecution delivered a powerful closing argument. They described how Ryan had orchestrated a pattern of manipulation and control, how he had taken Vanessa's life and nearly claimed mine as well. They highlighted his chilling meticulousness, his predatory tactics, and his complete lack of remorse. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Those 48 hours felt like an eternity. I stayed with Sarah, unable to return to my apartment with reporters still circling like vultures. We barely spoke, both lost in our own thoughts as we waited for the verdict. Finally, the call came. The jury had reached a decision. In the courtroom, silence hung heavily as the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict. Guilty on all counts. The room erupted in gasps and quiet sobs. Vanessa's parents clutched each other tightly, tears streaming down their faces. I felt my knees buckle slightly with the overwhelming flood of emotion, but Sarah caught my arm, steadying me. Ryan showed no reaction, no remorse, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. He simply stared ahead, his face eerily calm as the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led away in handcuffs, I met his eyes one last time. There was no fear in me, no hatred, only a strange emptiness. He would never have control over anyone again. Vanessa's voice had been heard. Her final message had exposed the truth. After the trial, my story became national news. Talk shows wanted interviews. Book publishers approached me. Documentarians requested exclusive rights to my story, but I declined them all. I didn't want to be defined by what Ryan had done. I wanted to heal. I wanted to live. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life. Therapy remained a cornerstone of my recovery. Sarah and Jenna stayed close, offering unwavering support. I moved to a new city, started a new job, and began the slow process of reclaiming my peace. The ring, once a symbol of my engagement, was now locked away as evidence. I never saw it again, but its message, Vanessa's final act of defiance, stayed with me. "You will never replace me." She had spoken from beyond the silence he tried to bury her in. And because of that message, we had both been freed. As time moved forward, I slowly began to reclaim pieces of my life that had been swallowed by fear and trauma. The world no longer saw me as the woman engaged to a murderer, but as a survivor who had exposed the truth. Still, even with justice served, the emotional scars remained. Every day was a battle between remembering and moving forward. Sarah remained my rock through it all. She never once let me feel like I was facing this alone. We often sat together late into the night, drinking tea, processing every layer of the nightmare that had unfolded. She encouraged me to write down my experiences, not for the media or publishers, but for myself. At first I resisted. The thought of reliving everything in such detail felt unbearable. But eventually I sat at my desk and began typing. The words came slowly at first, but soon they poured out of me. Writing became therapy, a safe place to release the emotions I had bottled up during the investigation and trial. The more I wrote, the more I began to understand how deeply Ryan's manipulation had infected every part of my life. He had not only tried to control me, but had nearly stolen my ability to trust my own instincts. Putting those feelings into words helped me untangle the knots he had tied in my mind. Jenna and I grew even closer during this time. Our bond had been forged in tragedy, but it became something stronger as we both worked to heal. She often visited me in my new city, bringing old photos of Vanessa, sharing stories that helped me see who Vanessa had been before Ryan entered her life. Hearing about Vanessa's dreams, her laughter, and her vibrant personality made me feel even more connected to her. She had been more than just a victim. She had been full of life and promise. And because of the warning she had hidden inside that ring, both of us had been able to stop Ryan's cycle of control and violence. One day, during one of Jenna's visits, she brought me something that took my breath away. It was a copy of Vanessa's personal journal, a separate one from the diary found in Ryan's storage. Jenna had discovered it while cleaning out their parents' attic. The journal contained pages of Vanessa's thoughts, fears, and hopes during her relationship with Ryan. As I flipped through the entries, my chest tightened. Vanessa had documented the emotional abuse she had suffered, the red flags she had seen too late, and the isolation Ryan had forced upon her. But she had also written letters to herself, affirmations of strength and courage that she never got to fully realize. Reading her words, I felt her voice reach out to me once again. It was a painful but powerful reminder of how closely our paths had mirrored each other. Jenna and I decided to honor Vanessa's memory by starting a foundation in her name. The foundation focused on supporting survivors of intimate partner abuse and educating the public about the early signs of manipulation and control. We partnered with shelters, therapists, and legal advocates to provide resources for those in need. The work gave us both a sense of purpose, transforming our grief into something meaningful. Through the foundation, I began speaking at conferences and workshops, sharing my story in controlled settings that felt safe and empowering. I met other survivors who had faced their own versions of Ryan, and together we formed a community built on mutual understanding and healing. Each person I met strengthened my resolve to continue the work. My speaking engagements eventually brought me into contact with lawmakers and advocacy groups seeking to reform domestic violence laws. I testified before state legislatures, sharing how easy it had been for Ryan to manipulate the system and hide his true nature. My testimony contributed to new legislation that improved background check protocols for engagement rings sold secondhand, implemented stricter regulations for law enforcement investigations into missing persons, and expanded support services for survivors of emotional abuse. The ripple effect of Vanessa's warning continued to grow. Years passed, and I slowly built a new life separate from the shadows of my past. I allowed myself to open up to new relationships cautiously. Trust did not come easily, but eventually I met someone who understood my boundaries and never pressured me to move faster than I was ready for. His name was Marcus. He was gentle, kind, and patient in a way that felt foreign but comforting. From the beginning, Marcus knew my story. I shared everything early on because I refused to build a relationship on half-truths. His response was exactly what I needed. He never treated me like I was broken. Instead, he saw my strength and respected the journey I had taken to reach that point. With Marcus, I experienced a kind of love that was built on trust, honesty, and mutual support. We grew together, creating a partnership that was free of control and fear. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to dream of a future untainted by my past. When Marcus proposed, it was in the most thoughtful way imaginable. He took me to a quiet spot by the lake, far from crowds and cameras, where the only sounds were the gentle lapping of water and the rustle of leaves. As he slipped the ring onto my finger, I noticed the inside of the band was smooth and blank. No engraving, no hidden message, just a clean slate. I smiled, tears filling my eyes, overwhelmed not by fear but by peace. This ring was different, this engagement was different, and this future was finally mine to shape. Our wedding was a small, intimate ceremony attended by close friends, family, and those who had supported me through the darkest chapters of my life. Sarah stood beside me as my maid of honor. Jenna delivered a heartfelt speech about resilience, survival, and honoring Vanessa's legacy. As I looked around the room, I saw faces filled with love and pride. The weight of the past was still there, but it no longer held me captive. Instead, it served as a reminder of how far I had come and how much light had broken through the darkness. Marriage brought a kind of healing that I hadn't fully expected. Sharing my life with Marcus felt natural, easy in ways that allowed me to finally release the tight grip I had kept on my emotions for so many years. Our home was filled with laughter, quiet moments, and a steady sense of safety that I had once feared would never be possible again. The foundation Jenna and I started continued to grow rapidly. We expanded our outreach programs, offering free counseling services, legal aid, and emergency housing for survivors trapped in situations much like the one Vanessa and I had faced. Each time a survivor walked through our doors and found safety, it felt like another victory in a war we refused to stop fighting. One of the most powerful changes came when our foundation helped lobby for the creation of a national registry that allowed law enforcement to flag patterns of abuse and controlling behavior even before violence escalated to more tragic levels. It was not a perfect system, but it was a step toward preventing people like Ryan from slipping through legal cracks again. The registry quickly gained attention from lawmakers across the country. States began adopting similar systems into their own legal frameworks, recognizing that emotional abuse, manipulation, and coercive control were often precursors to far more dangerous situations. Our work started appearing in national news outlets and legal journals, and we were invited to speak at international conferences on domestic abuse prevention. Through it all, I remained grounded by the people who had walked beside me from the very beginning. Sarah was now more than just a private investigator and my closest friend. She had become a partner in the foundation, using her skills to help identify high-risk cases before they turned deadly. Jenna took on a leadership role as well, becoming the face of advocacy for families who had lost loved ones to intimate partner violence. Together, we created a team bound not just by mission, but by deep, unbreakable trust. Despite the success, there were still moments when the shadows of my past crept back into my thoughts. Anniversaries of the trial, media stories about similar cases, or simply driving past certain locations sometimes triggered flashes of the fear I once lived with daily. Therapy remained part of my life, helping me navigate these moments with grace rather than letting them consume me. Marcus stood by me every time, never needing explanations, always offering quiet reassurance with his steady presence. A few years after our wedding, Marcus and I decided to start a family. The decision was not made lightly. I feared what kind of mother I would be, whether my past would cast its long shadow over my ability to parent. But as we prepared for the arrival of our child, those fears softened. The strength I had built over the years became my foundation for motherhood. When our daughter was born, I held her tiny body in my arms, tears streaming down my face. In that moment, I fully understood what it meant to have survived. My daughter represented everything Ryan had tried to steal from me but ultimately failed to destroy. She was proof that love, safety, and freedom were not only possible but thriving. Parenthood brought a new sense of purpose to my advocacy work. I became even more driven to ensure that no child would ever grow up in fear of someone like Ryan. The foundation expanded its programs to include education initiatives aimed at teaching young people about healthy relationships, consent, and recognizing early signs of emotional abuse. Our prevention programs were introduced into schools, empowering students to speak up long before dangerous situations could escalate. As my daughter grew older, she became curious about the work her mother did. In age-appropriate ways, I began explaining pieces of my story, emphasizing not the horror, but the strength that emerged from it. She learned about Vanessa as well, understanding that her life had played a critical role in helping others escape similar fates. When my daughter was old enough to understand fully, I gave her a copy of the journal I had written all those years ago during my healing process. She read every word with tears in her eyes, hugging me tightly afterward and whispering that she was proud of me. That moment was one of the most healing experiences of my entire journey. My story eventually caught the attention of a national publisher again, but this time I was ready. I worked closely with their editors to write a book that was not about sensationalizing my trauma, but about hope, resilience, and systemic change. The book became a bestseller, widely praised for its honest yet empowering approach to surviving intimate partner abuse. It was used in universities, law schools, and training programs for law enforcement, social workers, and therapists. The impact was far-reaching, bringing further attention to the gaps in the legal system and inspiring more reforms nationwide. Through the success of the book, I was invited to consult on national policy initiatives, helping shape legislation that addressed the prevention of coercive control and improved support systems for survivors. My voice was being heard in rooms of power where real change was possible. Vanessa's story lived on through every page, every speech, and every piece of legislation inspired by her bravery. One particular moment stood out as a full-circle moment for me. I was invited to speak at a national summit on domestic abuse prevention attended by lawmakers, advocates, survivors, and families from across the country. As I stepped onto the stage and looked out at the sea of faces, I spotted Jenna, Sarah, Marcus, and my daughter sitting in the front row, their eyes filled with pride. I took a deep breath and began sharing my journey. I spoke not as a victim, but as a survivor who had transformed unimaginable pain into something powerful. I honored Vanessa, whose voice had reached out from beyond to save both of us. I honored the countless survivors who had found strength in their own stories. And I honored the advocates who fought tirelessly for those still trapped in silence. As I concluded my speech, the entire auditorium stood in a long, thunderous ovation. My eyes locked with my daughter's, and I saw in her gaze the future I had fought so hard to create, one where cycles of control and abuse would be broken before they ever had the chance to take root. Years passed, and with every one of them, the distance between who I once was and who I had become grew wider. The foundation continued to flourish, expanding its reach beyond anything Jenna, Sarah, and I had initially imagined. We had opened offices in multiple states, trained thousands of professionals, and directly helped countless survivors escape dangerous situations. Each success felt like a tribute to Vanessa's memory, honoring the courage she showed in those final, desperate moments when she etched her warning inside that ring. My daughter grew into a remarkable young woman, full of confidence and empathy. She excelled in school, eventually pursuing a degree in social work with a focus on domestic abuse prevention. Watching her walk the same path I had once fought to create filled me with a kind of pride I struggled to put into words. She often accompanied me to conferences, standing proudly as I spoke, knowing exactly where my strength had been forged. Marcus remained my steady partner through it all. His unwavering support never faltered, even as the weight of my advocacy work sometimes threatened to consume me. He reminded me to rest, to breathe, to enjoy the simple moments of life that I had fought so hard to reclaim. Our marriage was a partnership built on mutual respect, understanding, and an unspoken vow to never allow darkness into the safe world we had built together. As my public profile grew, so did my opportunities to effect meaningful change on a global scale. I was invited to serve on international panels addressing coercive control, stalking, and intimate partner abuse. My expertise, once born out of tragedy, became a tool for reform across multiple countries. Laws were rewritten, policies strengthened, and prevention programs implemented based on the very patterns I had once been trapped in. One of the most surreal moments of my career came when I was invited to speak at the United Nations. Standing in that grand assembly hall, addressing leaders from around the world, I felt the full weight of my journey settle on my shoulders. I spoke not as a victim, not even as a survivor, but as a voice for those who still could not speak. I shared Vanessa's story, my own, and the countless others who had faced similar horrors. I outlined the legislative gaps, the systemic failures, and the desperate need for early intervention and survivor-centered policies. The applause that followed was thunderous. But more importantly, it led to real policy commitments from multiple nations determined to strengthen protections against domestic violence and coercive control. After that speech, I received letters from survivors all over the world. Some were only beginning their journeys to freedom. Others had already found it. Each story was a reminder of why I had chosen to share my pain so openly. The ripple effect of that engraved message continued to spread across borders, breaking the silence that predators like Ryan had once depended on to operate. Jenna, Sarah, and I eventually established a global coalition, connecting advocacy organizations from different countries to share resources, research, and strategies. The coalition grew quickly, creating a powerful network dedicated to eradicating the patterns of abuse that had destroyed so many lives. Despite all the progress, I never forgot the girl I once was, standing terrified in my own home, staring at that haunting message inside the ring. "You will never replace me." Vanessa's final act of courage had not only saved me, but had ignited a movement that neither of us could have predicted. That legacy became even more personal when my daughter graduated and joined our foundation full-time. Her passion for the work matched my own, and together we expanded our youth education programs, ensuring that future generations would recognize and reject the earliest signs of abuse long before they escalated into something more dangerous. On the 20th anniversary of Vanessa's disappearance, Jenna and I organized a memorial in her honor. Families, survivors, advocates, and lawmakers gathered to reflect on how far we had come and how much further we still had to go. As I stood before the crowd, my voice steady, I spoke of Vanessa not just as a victim, but as a hero whose bravery had sparked change on a global scale. We unveiled a scholarship fund in her name, designed to support survivors pursuing careers in law, advocacy, or counseling. The fund represented everything Vanessa had been denied, but had helped others achieve through her silent plea for help. That night, under the stars, Jenna and I sat together in quiet reflection. She reached for my hand, her voice soft but filled with emotion as she whispered how proud Vanessa would be. I nodded, my throat tight with unshed tears. "She is here in every life we save," I whispered back. "In every law we change, every survivor we protect, she lives on." Life, though marked by trauma, had become something beautiful, something powerful. I had not only reclaimed my own future, but had built a legacy far stronger than the darkness that once tried to consume me. My journey, once rooted in unimaginable pain, had become a testament to resilience, hope, and the power of one small act of courage to change the world.